Thank you all for being here today. Hopefully, this is going to be the first of a lot of these sort of sessions. We've been doing webinars for a while here at Forio. However, they're a lot of times they've been more sim specific. They've been about, how do you use Everest? How do you use Wildfire? How do you use Bond Trader? What's M&A wine country? We've been doing a lot of those because there is a lot of like specific interest on how do you lead a specific simulation, or what are the benefits of doing this sim versus this sim. Or I think I see a lot of familiar names on the list right now of that attended our Epicenter webinar. So how do you build a sim either with us or without us on our platform? So we've had a lot of these webinars specifically on our sims, our platform, how do you use it. However, especially as I look at a lot of the names on the list today, I know we started realizing there is a massive amount of interest in how do you lead these simulations? Not just how do you run it, but how do you actually run it? How do you take this thing from start to finish? And this is a service that we provide at Forio. However, I myself am not an expert in that. We don't have any consultants or facilitators on staff at Forio. We build the sims and we actually help you understand how to use them. But when it comes to facilitating events, we often outsource that to our partners, such as Ryan Klinger, who's on the call with us today. And that is what we're going to be discussing today is how do you lead simulations? What are some good tips and tricks? What's the difference between running a sim yourself versus hiring a facilitator? What's the pros? What's the cons? We'll dive into all of that today. But I've been talking a lot here, I think a good solid 2 minutes. So I do want to kick it over to our guest today, who hopefully is going to do the majority of the talking. And that is my friend and colleague, Dr. Ryan Klinger. He and I have been working together, seems like nonstop for the last 5 years on some facilitated events. But Ryan, it's a pleasure to have you. And go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience that we have today.
All right. Well, I guess you've got it there on the slide. You're welcome to read all of the nitty-gritty details, but the short and sweet, my name is Ryan Klinger. I'm an associate professor in the management department at Old Dominion University. I first got into these simulations way back in 2013, actually. One of my colleagues, when I was first hired at Old Dominion University, a professor by the name of Will Judge, was developing the change management simulation, the Sunglass Spectrum simulation, in conjunction with Forio and the Harvard Business School. And Dr. Judge asked me if I could be sort of a guinea pig and help him with some last minute tweaks and last minute, sort of product development as they were just about to roll out the simulation. So yeah, he asked me to assume the role of a student. And he said, after the simulation, I'm going to ask you a whole bunch of questions. I want you to assume that you're a student and you're in an MBA class and you're going through the simulation. And I remember going through the entire simulation. Then he started asking me questions. And I said, Bill, I'm sorry, but I can't tell you what it was like assuming the role of a student because I was so captivated by the simulation itself that as soon as it started, I was a change agent at Sunglass Spectrum Company. I was not thinking about this as a student before. That's when sort of the light switch, flipped for me, just how immersive and engaging these simulations are. So I've been using the simulations since 2013, mainly in my academic career, using them in the MBA classroom. I teach classes in leadership, emotional intelligence, just general management classes as well. And I found that using these simulations is just an amazing opportunity to create some really powerful learning experiences. I first got hooked up with Forio. Brock, you said 2000, or you said 5 years. It's actually been about 8 years, I guess.
Mm.
2018 was the first time I did a simulation for Forio. They called up and they asked if I could be an external facilitator. I said I'd love the challenge. Had a absolutely wonderful time. And fortunately, they called up afterwards and said that it was a great experience and they'd love to be able to, tap into my expertise in the future. And here we are, some number of years later. I was looking through my notes there. Last month, I completed my 100th facilitated event with Forio. I've done 6 different simulations. My personal favorites, though, are the leadership climbing Mount Everest simulation, a great simulation where people work in teams to try to conquer Mount Everest together, and then the change management simulation that I alluded to before, where people operate as a change agent within an organization, trying to drive transformative change through their company. Thinking about my experience across a variety of different simulations, we've worked big and small. We've worked at all different levels of the organization. Probably our largest events that we've done have been maybe 250, 300 live attendees. And then we've also done incredibly intimate events with just a handful of participants working on Sims together. We've also done Sims at all different levels of the organizational hierarchy. I mentioned before 250 participants. One particular experience was all interns, right? An organization flew all of their interns out, had them all in sort of a stadium seating conference room, and we hosted a live session with people that hadn't even formally been a member of the organization yet, all the way up to C-suite execs and running sessions with them. So I feel like I have a diverse experience to draw on, and I'm happy to share my experience with you all.
Appreciate it, Ryan. There's some of that we're going to dig into, so I don't want to jump too far ahead with the questions. But we're going to be getting into those of, the difference between leading an event with a team of executives versus leading with a team of interns. But, just talking on, the work that I've gotten to do with you over the years, one of my favorite things of what you bring to facilitating event is that you're not a consultant. Although you do consulting, but you're not there as a consultant. You're not there as someone who is simply a facilitator who knows how to facilitate. You are a subject matter expert. You've been published. You actually do the research in this field. So for those of you who have met me that are on this call, you're not just dealing with me who I've gotten really comfortable with the sim. You actually know the intricacies and how to adapt. Hey, this team needs to discuss one thing over versus another. This team actually we need to look closer at psychological safety. So that's one of the things I've really appreciated about the work that we've done with you over the years is watching how you adapt your debriefs, your facilitation to the client, to their needs. That's been something that I think has set you apart in some of the other facilitated events that I've seen from other companies.
That's great to hear you say that. I think I've always taken pride in the fact that even though I guess technically it would be a consulting event, I never wear that consultant's hat. I'm never trying to, sell a product or sell an idea to people. I've always sort of kept my academic hat on and approached the simulations with business professionals the same way I've approached the simulations with students in the classroom in terms of just how can we maximize learning. But I do want to say, Brock, what you mentioned there, I do personally do research on leadership and psychological safety, and so it's always interesting to bring my research into the conversations. But really, from a selfish perspective, a lot of my research ideas have come from these simulated events where, it's like, well, we've been publishing studies on psychological safety for years, and we've always talked about it in this way. And then we put people through a simulated event where they're climbing Mount Everest, and all of a sudden they're talking about it from a completely different perspective. We need to research that. We need to dig deeper. So, selfishly, one of the main reasons I love doing these simulated environments is because it really does sort of keep me on the cutting edge for my academic career as well.
Yeah, I mean, my favorite thing about simulations from top to bottom is it moves you out of theory. It moves you out of I would have done this had I have been in that situation. I would not have made that mistake if I was making decisions. And it's like, okay, let's see if that's true. And it's a completely different ball game. Some of the events that we've run together, and then some of the train the trainers that I've done with teams who shall remain nameless. It's fascinating to watch, a room full of executives who have read all of the books, who know all the literature. You put them in that pressurized situation of Everest, wildfire, patient zero, and it is all going out the window, which is, what's great about Sims is it takes it from, hey, I've read this, I've studied this, and now I am practicing this, and I can see the cognitive biases, the logical fallacies, I literally fall into all of those traps. So that's been, one of my favorite things over the years of seeing these Sims in action and being able to watch different people play these games. So we'll move into the questions now. I do need to introduce myself. It is not as impressive as your background. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brock Vickers. I do work with Forio on the sales side as well as some of the creative side. So if you ever do want to build a sim, more than happy to help you write scripts, more than happy to help you find actors and direct your scenes if you need them. But then also, my favorite thing to do is finding the right sim for you. So that is my job here, Forio. And today I'm going to be serving as the host of this webinar. And we're going to actually start diving now into, Ryan, some of your experiences and some of your expertise. So You've already talked briefly about how long you've been using these sims. You've talked about how Bill Judge introduced you to the change management sim and how you got started in facilitating events with us. But ultimately, I would say, like, you've talked a little bit about experiential learning, but what is your favorite thing about using a simulation, or the benefits of a sim versus the benefits of a case study, or just teaching the concept? So what's your favorite part about, I mean, it can be each of them, or how they stack, or how they're different from one another.
Yeah. Before we get there, Brock is absolutely selling himself short on the bio. He is generally the most interesting man in the room whenever you get an opportunity to be around him, and an incredibly creative mind. So, always a pleasure working with you, Brock.
Thank you.
But yeah, what keeps me coming back to the simulations, both in the academic setting and opportunities to work as external facilitators. First and foremost, selfishly, they're fun. Right. It's way more fun to teach using a simulation than to teach using a case study or a lecture or any opportunity that I can get to be that sort of fly on the wall observer and watch people struggling through the immersive environments of the simulations is just way more enjoyable for me. But I don't think that's the answer that you want to hear. And so I'll definitely dig deeper into that. But definitely some major advantages to using simulations for learning as opposed to lectures or PowerPoint slides or case studies. First and foremost, simulations just create that immersive and engaging environment. And it's so important. One of the hardest parts as an instructor trying to get people to learn is that if they're not motivated to learn, if they're not, excited about learning, it's just in one ear and out the other, right?
Hmm.
There's always the saying, you can take a camel to the water, but you can't make them drink, or I don't know if it's a horse or whatever it is, right? But same thing with learning. You can throw all of the information out to people, but if they're not engaged, if they're not immersed in the activity, if they're not, shining the attentional spotlight on what it is you're trying to get them to think about, it doesn't stick. And the beauty of the simulations, at least all of the simulations that I've ever worked with Foreo, is just how incredibly immersive and engaging they are. And whether somebody intentionally comes to a session excited to learn, or doesn't, once that simulation starts, they're committed, right? They're
Hmm.
in. They're really wanting to perform at a level that they'll ultimately be proud of, and then the learning is just a byproduct of their experience. The other major thing is that, especially compared to something like reading about concepts or themes or theories in a book, is that you learn by doing, right? It's not just learning what to do, but learning how to do it. And so there's that skill development angle to the simulations that's so incredibly valuable. So especially if you're someone that's looking to use the simulation to train people to develop their skills, right? There's no better way to do it than through simulated experiences. But I think one of the main issues that I've found with using what I'll call traditional traditional teaching tools, is that a lot of times the participant or the learner, they have a really hard time um, dealing with hindsight. Or what I mean by that is, a lot of times if you give them a case study, and in the case study they're learning about a CEO who made a series of bad decisions, and then the organization struggled, and then they had to go in and clean up the mess, right? Or if you have somebody read about some particular best practices for leading change or something like that, a lot of times the learner is just going through that material and saying, well, yeah, it's so obvious that that person was doing the wrong thing. I never would have made those mistakes. Or they're reading through a list of best practices, and they're saying, oh, yeah, of course I'm going to do all of those things. I already know all this stuff, right? And so it's really hard to help somebody realize what their own knowledge gaps are, what their own limitations are, what their own cognitive biases are, or how their own particular approaches or styles have weaknesses or create barriers to success. And that's what the simulations are so great about doing, right? All of the simulations that I've used, the thing that I love about them is that they're challenging. They are not designed to be simulations where everybody gets to the finish line and then pats themselves on the back and talks about how amazing they are, right? They are simulations that are designed to be very difficult and to cause people to struggle. And it really snaps that self-awareness into the fact that I'm not perfect. I don't know everything, or my approach to doing this or handling this issue might not be the best particular approach, or there might be opportunities to learn. And so that opportunity to use simulations to build self-awareness about limitations and learning gaps and things like that is so powerful to creating the environment that you need to then build people back up or give
Mhm.
people the tools they need to be successful. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's fascinating because the in the ready to run catalog there are 65 plus sims. There are some that are hyper specifics like the beer game or Bond Trader that these are sims where it is going to focus on one thing and one thing only, and you're going to be amazed at how many people fall into that same trap. Now, just in case there's some student attending this, I'm not going to say what those traps are or tricks are, but it's amazing where we have these, very classic, simple simulations, air quotes around that, all the way up to then the very complex ones where you've got you're going to have debates, you're going to have arguments, you're going to have goal asymmetry, you're going to have conflict over what a fact means. So you've got those very simple sims that are going to teach these very hard lessons, and then you've got these very complex sims where the Everest, the wildfires, patient zeros, where there's ambiguity, there's nuance, and the game doesn't happen on the screen. The game happens between the players out that are in the room. So it's like it's moving it away from, oh, I'm doing a training video where I've got to learn my HR rules or whatever it might be, to you and I are engaging, you and I are having a discussion, and we have to make hard decisions which may have some trade-offs to them within the game itself. And I think that often surprises people of, oh, I've done something like this before, to like you are really engaged with your team, hence the team building element of some of these games, but just the layers of complexity. But with that, so you've got your hands in two different worlds. You're in academia, but then you also work with us and other companies outside of Forio. So are there any differences between running these sims with college age students or even MBA students versus running them with new professionals, managers, executives? Have you ever noticed a difference, or is it amazing how similar they are?
I think there's more similarities than there are differences, but there's definitely things that I like better about using simulations in academia versus using it in corporate environments. And then there's definitely things that I like better about or definitely recognize as, pros of doing this in a corporate environment that we don't necessarily get to deal with in an academic environment. I think the main difference is time, right? In an academic
Mhm.
environment, I get 16 weeks with students and I get all sorts of contact points with students and we could really take our time in terms of making it sure everybody knows how to log into the simulation, how to use the user interfaces. We have the time to allow people to do practice rounds or to allow people to run the simulation once and then really try to learn and then do the simulation a second time. We have a ton of time to debrief, and we can carry the debrief forward through future conversations. Whereas a lot of times when we do this simulation in a corporate environment, we've got 3 hours, and it's like, okay, the simulation has a start time and end time, and then it's done.
Mhm.
Uh, so I've never done a simulation where I said that was too much time. I wish I had less time. I've always done the simulations and said these simulations are so complex, they're so rich, there's so many things we could address. I wish I would have had more time. But on the other end of the spectrum, I think the one thing that I really struggle with in an academic environment that we don't get as much in the corporate environment is that in the academic environment, there's a lot of pressure to perform in terms of, the evaluative component of the simulation, right? The students
Mhm.
typically thinking about the simulation, not necessarily only in terms of, what do I need to do to learn, but also what do I need to do to get a good grade?
Yep.
Uh, and that perspective kind of shifts the focus from a learning orientation to a performance orientation, and oftentimes can prevent them from doing the things that they need to do to really capture the learning moments. Um,
Mhm.
and then the other thing is, in an academic environment, the students typically look at the simulations from a me perspective, right? How does this help me personally? Whereas in a corporate environment, not only do they look at the simulation from the me perspective, but also from the we perspective, right? It's
Mhm.
not only how does this simulation help me personally, but how does this simulation help my team? How does it help us as an organization? What can we do, and how can we benefit from the simulation? So that's a unique perspective that I love about running the simulations in the corporate environment.
Yeah, I know you were talking about students that you have, and they're conscious of their grades, and you've mentioned that to me a couple times when we were doing Everest, and I try to comprehend like how you would get a grade on Everest because of knowing how we've built that simulation and how many tricks and traps there are.
Right.
But then the flip side of that is, when I mostly interact with the corporate partners that we have, and it's like that one thing that you can't reproduce when it's just like, if you're sitting, in your sunroom over breakfast reading, oh, this is what happened with this company. I could, like we've talked about, it's like, oh, I would make different decisions versus that pressure you feel of I've got to finish this in 90 minutes, where that pressure you feel of my colleague is sitting opposite of me, my CEO is leading this team. How do I argue with them? Do I like you can't recreate that unless you're in that situation and seeing people switch from that passively consuming data to actively engaging or not, because I've also seen the opposite of that of people shutting down or getting frustrated. So, it's fascinating to see those things come to life when we do these events.
Yeah.
We did have a question come in through the Q&A section. So any of our guests today, if you want to drop a line into the Q&A, we'll try to get to them as we go. And so the question that we have from Kevin is where we're looking at is how do you handle using a simulation itself versus a digital twin? Or, I'm going to try to interpret this question a little bit, Kevin. Tell me if I'm wrong here, but like, how do you treat the simulation versus how this might go down in real life? So, we have our problems that occur in Everest. We're talking about team building. How do you bridge the gap between what we do in the simulation, the mistakes we might make, and then what our actual jobs are and the decisions we'll make in real life?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And ultimately that's the $1 million question, right? That's whenever we do the simulation, that is always a critical part of the debrief is we really want to make sure that the simulation, that the focus in debriefing the simulation isn't about how do I solve the challenges within the simulation, because I'm never going to experience those, I'm never going to have to deal with a zombie apocalypse or, deal with, the oxygen canisters and climbing Mount Everest, right? It's really how do we create that transfer of knowledge from the simulation to the real world? And personally, what I try to do as an external facilitator is I try to not answer that question myself. I try to turn it on to the participants themselves and really, guide the participants to understanding that if they can't make that leap from the simulation to their professional life, then what was it all for, right?
Mhm.
And we can create the sense of urgency and build that into the debrief of, hey, now let's as a team really try to make the important connections between the simulation and the professional challenges that we're facing. If we can't do that, then we're really missing out in the simulation. So I really try to turn that onto the group and challenge them to do that. And then my role is just to sit back and use probing questions to stimulate critical thinking and guide them to those realizations. But ultimately, it has to be their own sort of personal aha moments.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think you kind of set us up for our next actual like scheduled question, which is, getting to the nuts and bolts of how do we lead these events? I would say in my time here at Forio, I've seen a big shift over who is running these sims, how they're being used. And a lot of times you're getting people who, they don't facilitate professionally or they're not a consultant. They're the head of L&D. They are, someone who is boots on the ground. They're working and they want to use this simulation to get a point across or create a great team building experience. So let's shift a little bit to how we actually run simulations or when you and I work together and we're going to facilitate for a client. So, what are some tips and tricks or some best practices that you've seen for, how to lead a good event?
Yeah, that's something I've thought about a lot of because I thought, wow, if we can just kind of, put everything into a recipe for success, then all we have to do is repeat the recipe over and over. And the biggest challenges that we always face is that, the recipe for success depends on what meal you're making. And every event is sort of making a different meal, right? And
Mhm.
so one of the biggest things that I try to do when we first meet with a client is really try to get a good understanding of what they're trying to accomplish and where the simulation fits into their sort of purpose, right? Because I think that one of, the simulations, obviously they're so sort of dialed in terms of anybody can just take it off the shelf and run it and it's going to be a great experience. But the real the real value that you can get out of doing these simulations is really customizing the simulation to meet whatever the needs are that you're trying to accomplish. So one of the things that we always do, that Brock and myself always do, is we really try to sit down and do our pre-work. I see on the slide it mentioned pre-work, to get a good sense of how the simulation really fits into the grander scheme of things, and then how we can customize the simulation, right? And from my experience, there's been sort of a couple of different types of events that we use the simulations for. One is sort of the standalone workshop, right? Where we just get to go in, run the simulation, try to extract as much value from the simulation itself, and then get out and call it a day. And those are fun, and those are easy, and those are relatively simple and straightforward. But a lot of times what we're seeing is that the simulation is part of a larger developmental series where it's really important for us to work together ahead of time to really figure out how to position the simulation to best fit and play nice with everything else that we're trying to accomplish within this developmental series, right? So
Hmm.
sometimes it might be, like a 4-day event where the simulation is at the very beginning. And in that case, we're really trying to model the simulation so that it introduces a lot of the themes that are going to be covered throughout the rest of the events in the series. And then other times the simulation is sort of that end of the series, capstone, where we're trying to use a simulation to reinforce a lot of the learning that's come upstream. And so, one of the things that's really important is really understanding what your purpose is and how the simulation fits into the grander scheme, and then trying to figure out how to, design the simulation around what you're trying to accomplish.
One of the things I laugh about is, many of our sims talk about you've got to establish a goal. You have to have an agreed upon objective. You got to come up with a process and a purpose, and a yada yada yada. But the funny thing is, like, even in the fact of setting up these sims and like what you just discussed, it's like you actually have to do it for the simulation itself too, where it's like, hey, what are we trying to get out of this? Everest is a great example because it's got probably 18 different topics that you could address or things that are going to come up, and you've got to say like, hey, which one of these do we actually want to cover? So it's just always funny of like, you actually have to do the same thing your team is going through for the simulation itself, which again I guess could show the power of the event itself, is it's going to apply in different capacities. Yeah.
And I think that's going back to the question of how do you best lead a simulation based event. I think that that's such an important thing to think about, especially with some of the more complex and rich simulations, just because there's so many different themes that you can cover. And
Hmm.
so we've typically taken a couple of different approaches to to managing the simulation, and especially the debrief that comes after the simulation, right? So on one end of the continuum, we've sort of pitched events and done events where our role as a facilitator is to be more of a facilitator and to use sort of the Socratic method of
Hmm.
using, stimulating questions to get people to think about the issues, but really not having an agenda, right? We
Yep.
we start the simulation with no agenda. Our only agenda is to let the participants who have just experienced the simulation identify their own aha moments, right? And then the agenda sort of evolves organically around those aha realizations of, wow, I didn't realize that this was so important, or wow, I didn't realize how much this connects to some of the challenges that I'm experiencing in my professional life. And so in those approaches to running the simulation, without an agenda, our goal is just to kind of get people to have those aha realizations. And
Yeah.
then at the opposite end of the spectrum, a lot of times we're going to do a lot of pre-work ahead of the simulation to say, okay, what are the specific learning objectives? Are there any specific values that you want to really reinforce? Are there any specific, takeaway moments or frameworks or best practices that you really want me to drill on? And then in those types of simulations, my role is less of a facilitator and more of an instructor, right?
Mhm.
I'm saying, hey, let's draw connections, let's raise critical frameworks, talk about theories, build best practices together. And so, either approach works extremely well. And by the way, those are two ends of the continuum. And
Mhm.
very rarely is any session that extreme, right? A lot of
Yeah.
times it's somewhere in between. But I think it's really important to know what you're trying to accomplish, and then really build around that.
And just one thing to add there is, I think sometimes when we're looking at these sims and we're looking at some of the people who created them, Mike Roberto, Amy Edmondson, different people who have done a lot of work in fields of leadership, psychological safety. I even think we can be intimidated of, oh, I've got to be the sage on the stage. Like I've got to do this, and then I've got to go and I've got to do this eloquent debrief with a million PowerPoint slides that's really going to hammer it home. And one of my favorite things about these simulations is like actually the sims do a lot of the heavy lifting, and like you said, you can just ask questions. You can empower the team of like, hey, what did you learn? What are you taking away from this? And I've seen you do that. I know you can, if you wanted to, you could go and do an hour-long presentation on leadership, but I've watched you do such a great job of like actually empowering the learners to tell you what they discovered, how did they discover it, what do they think they would do different, and really have that Socratic method. And that's something that's always beneficial, is the experiential learning doesn't stop at the end of the game. You continue it into your debrief and allow the players to actually participate.
Absolutely. And if I had to give, a list of best practices, probably
Hmm.
comment number one or advice number one is how important it is, Brock, just what you said, to have the participants take ownership of the learning experience, right?
Yeah.
From the very beginning of the event, you want to set this up as, hey, you are empowered to discover your own connections and not only for yourself, what are your own personal aha moments, but you're also empowered to create a conversation around it that helps your peers and colleagues benefit from your aha moments and
Hmm.
your discovery.
Yeah. And on that note, well, obviously, I think we've talked about sometimes it can be intimidating to think that I've got to be this expert and I've got to know everything. And I can go ahead and tell, I mean, some of you who are on the call today, you've seen some of these facilitation guides, 100 pages long with, hyperlinks to other documents you could read, which is very useful and it's very interesting, especially if you're on the scholarly academic side, but it can be overwhelming. The other thing that I think that typically scares people is like, hey, what's going to go wrong? What could we obviously we can't calculate for everything, but you and I have certainly seen our share of events. You said you've officially done 100 with us, and God knows how many in the academic sphere. But there we do see some common things that will go wrong. So I've got one in my pocket, but I'm going to wait to hold that one because being the guy on the sales side and the tech side, I think everyone can imagine where that goes. But for you, what are some things that you've seen that either derail a successful event or have prevented teams from succeeding? It can be either things that didn't happen in the pre-work, or it could actually be in the events themselves of bad habits or something that might come out. So what are some of the things that you've seen that maybe can derail a successful event?
Yeah, I think one of the beauties of discussing these things is that they typically derail events until you recognize that they're potential
Mm.
obstacles. Once you know that it's a potential obstacle, it's relatively easy to plan around it or to avoid the obstacle or to have a contingency plan in place in case it does arise. But I kind of put it into a few different buckets of the potential derailers. First and foremost, it's poor planning, right?
Mm.
It's not really doing enough work on the front end to make sure that you fully understand what you're getting yourself into. And in that regard, I think the one I've seen the most is just not allocating enough time to the simulations.
Yeah.
It's reading the manual, and the manual says, "Oh, this simulation takes at least 2 hours," and then it's saying, "Well, maybe we can do it in 60 minutes," right? Or the
Yeah.
simulation says 4 hours, and you say, "Well, maybe I can do it in 2 hours." And you can do it in 2 hours or 60 minutes. Like you can do it in a shortened amount of time, but it's gonna involve shortcuts, right? It's
Yep.
gonna involve maybe the users not getting enough intro
Hmm.
familiarity with the user interface, or maybe the user's not getting enough time to really dig deep into the debrief. And so a lot of times we see people that will say, well, we really want to fit this into a condensed session. And then after the session, they say, Ryan, that would have been a lot better if we would have given you 30 more minutes or something
Yeah.
like that. We weren't so rushed. So the one thing I would say is, if you're going to commit the resources to doing the simulation, make sure you commit the resources to doing it well, right?
Hmm.
The other thing in poor planning is stuff that's generally has nothing to do with the simulation itself or the technology itself. It's just the other resources that are required to support these types of events
Hmm.
not being through, right? And
Yeah.
so, for instance, a lot of times we'll do some events where we're meeting at a hotel conference room. And we're doing the event in a hotel conference room. And at that point, we're kind of beholden to the IT at that particular hotel. And
Hmm.
they don't have their stuff together. And if their Wi-Fi isn't working or the room isn't appropriate for, the simulation itself, that can really cause a lot of issues. So on the front end, I think the major issue is just making sure you plan through everything to so that you have the resources to support what you're trying to do. Uh,
Yeah.
During the simulation itself, though, the major problems are just unexpected issues that pop up. Like what happens if we're halfway through a simulation and Wi-Fi drops? Or what happens if you have a whole bunch of people registered to attend events and then a lot of them just don't show up for the event?
Hmm.
Or what happens if the event is part of a whole day workshop and you're running behind because a previous session ran long? And those types of issues, if you're not prepared for them, they can really catch you off guard and cause an event to derail.
Hmm.
But as long as you're really prepared for them and you say, "Hey, I've got a plan in place," we've had times where we've done events where we've said, if you expect that participants might not show up or they might drop off, maybe we'll have a few participants, sort of on deck that we
Hmm.
can fill in, right? Or if we know that an event is running behind, let's talk ahead of time about how we can slice off minutes in different sessions of the event to fit it into the new window, right? Those sorts of issues. Again, if you anticipate them and you have a plan in place, they're fine. But in my experience, the major thing that makes or breaks an event is the people, right?
Hmm.
It's the people, and it's sort of the culture that emerges from the moment the session starts to the to the point where the people are debriefing. And so some of the things that can happen is just you get silence, right? You're, as a facilitator, you're asking all of the right questions. The simulation itself is incredibly engaging, and then people are just, silent. They're just staring at you with the deer in the
Hmm.
head look. Or if it's a virtual event, they've got their cameras off and their microphones off.
Yeah.
And again, once you know that this is a potential thing that can derail the event, well, now you've got the steps in place to kind of fix it, right? So
Yeah.
then you're going to make sure that ahead of time you communicate with the participants so that they know that they're expected to be active contributors to the learning experience, right? Or you're going to do some icebreaker activities, or you're going to set ground rules about whether people can turn their cameras off or mics off or what it may be,
Yeah.
right? Another issue with the people side of derailing events is people just not feeling safe to open up, right? A
Hmm.
lot of the simulations where the real learning comes from is the people struggling during the simulation and then reflecting on their struggles afterwards and saying, "Yeah, that was hard," or "I thought I was prepared for that, but my approach didn't work," or whatever it may be. And it's that sort of openness and honesty and self-reflection that creates a ripple of learning moments throughout the entire event. And so, you don't want to create an environment where people are afraid to open up and they don't have that psychological safety, right? Which is one of the
Yeah.
main themes
Yeah.
of some of these simulations. But again, once you know that that's a potential barrier, well, then as a facilitator, that's your role, that's your goal, is to create that environment where those barriers don't exist. And then the last one I'll say in terms of the people, going back to what I mentioned in an academic environment, this is very common, but even in a business environment, it becomes common as well. It is people being overly concerned about their performance outcomes, right? Most of these simulations have some sort of score mechanism built into them. And as soon as people are so focused on, how do I get the highest score?
Yep.
Or
Yeah.
how do I blame or find excuses for not getting the highest score, right? As soon as that's their mentality, then all of a sudden these ego defense mechanisms kick in,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of excuses, and there's not a lot of sort of that personal honesty that you need in order to benefit from the learning experience.
Yeah, we get a lot of times after events are run with us, people will reach out and they'll, okay, so what's the answer, or how do I beat it? And it's like, well, it's not designed to be beat. One of my favorite things about the sim, well, I shouldn't say the name of it again, just in case this goes out there, but we have a simulation that is all about cognitive biases. And one of the biggest takeaways is that you can't beat a cognitive bias. That, like, by putting something in place to beat the cognitive bias, you're just creating another bias. And so it's like, it's not a sim that you can beat. You can't just like, oh, I'm going to get out in front of this and I'm going to win. And in fact, we have other sims where it's like, if you try to win, it actually turns out worse for you. So it's very much like you said. It's more about the environment. It's, what are your takeaways, and really being in the moment, either with your team or engaging with the game, and not trying to. I'd say the only thing I would add is, like, if I was to offer tips to everyone, is you really want your players to be engaged. Like you said, you want to carve out enough time, and it's like, hey, while we're doing this, I know it's hard, but don't check your emails. Don't go out. Don't take a sales call in the middle of it. I know we're taking 3 hours out of your day, but, like, let's be focused on this for the next 3 hours, I think is always a good strategy. We are getting towards the end of our time, so I do want to make sure we end on a positive note, and we talk about, the best events. What are some of the best events that you've been a part of, and what make them so great?
Ooh, I think well, the most memorable events, and I guess maybe this is like, how do you define the best of it? But for me, the most memorable events are the ones where the team really leans into creating an immersive environment, and really sort of sets the simulation up well. I'll give you an example. One of our favorite simulations is climbing Mount Everest, and I've done events where teams will, the sort of on the ground support will put the AC as low as possible so that when people walk into their room, they're freezing cold. We had one event where people used fog machines to simulate, like being at high altitude, and there were, ribbons all over, like simulating these like Buddhist prayer flags that you would see in Mount Everest. And so it's like when people walked into their room, they were, like you said, you want people to be immersed and engaged. Well, it's hard not to be immersed and engaged when the environment is like that. But those are the ones that are very memorable and stand out in my mind. But for me, I think the best events comes back to the people, right? And it's very rarely something that I do or say as a facilitator that causes me after the event to say, "Oh, Ryan, you're a genius. You really nailed that one," right? It's much more often it's just creating that environment early on where the people take ownership of the learning experience, where they're very open to sharing their trials and tribulations. And going back to what Kevin asked before, it's where the people say, let's draw the connections between the simulation and what we're trying to experience. And they're sort of guiding the conversation. It's the simulations where, I might ask two or three questions in the debrief, but then I just sit back and I say, they're on it. They're looking at this simulation from the right perspective, and I don't want to mess up the beauty that's being made here. So I think that if you as your role as a facilitator, if you overcome some of those potential obstacles, you can create that culture within the session that
Mhm.
allows you to just sit back and let the beauty be made from the people.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's in the name, right? Like, your job is to facilitate the
Right.
conversation, not to, like, lead the conversation, or tell them what the insights are. It's like, hey, what did you experience? And, like, really leaning into their experience and their learnings, and then, sprinkling in, like, the key concepts and the lessons along the way. Um, yeah, well, Ryan, I really appreciate your time today. I want to be very respectful of everyone who joined the call today. So thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully, we'll be doing much more of these in the future. Ryan, hopefully, we'll have you back. There were so many questions we actually didn't even get to today, but you know what? That's what happens. That's why there's a lot of podcasts out there that are 5 hours long. However, I don't think anyone on the call today would have sat through that. If you would, let us know. We'll start, going on Spotify. But we really appreciate your time today, Ryan. And hopefully, we'll be able to connect with some of these people in the future. For the people on the call, obviously, if you'd like to connect with Ryan, if you'd like to connect with us, let us know. Obviously, you can. If you couldn't tell, Ryan's very enthusiastic about leading events. I've seen him in action. He's absolutely fantastic at dealing with some of the challenges he spoke about, but also connecting with the different companies he's worked with and really digging into, hey, what are we trying to do today? What are we trying to accomplish? And it's not just a rote memorization of, hey, this was my script that I did 5 years ago, and now this is the exact same monologue I'm going to give you 5 years later. I've watched Ryan, like, really be very nuanced, incorporate the ideas that you're trying to, companies are trying to get across and change from one event to the next. So it's been one of my favorite things of watching you over the years. But if anyone would like to get in touch with you or find you, is there any way, they can reach out, website, email, if somebody would like to learn more, anything that you'd like to share publicly or not?
Probably the easiest way is through LinkedIn,
Okay.
just because my username is Ryan Klinger one, right? Or just
Mhm.
type Ryan Klinger and look for this face here, or by email rklinger@odu.edu, or just reach out to Brock and the Forio team, and I'm sure that they can push the message my way. But it's always a pleasure to work with you, Brock. Thank you so much, and looking forward to doing something like this again.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to be shutting this down now. If you had some questions and you didn't get to them, feel free to reach out to us. You can reach us at sales@forio.com. You can connect with me directly at bvickers@forio.com. Any questions that you might have, any sims that you want to see, if you want to discuss facilitation or, dive deeper into, how we can help you run your event, we're more than happy to help. That's, I think, my favorite thing about this job is, we have our simulations, but my job is to help you as much as possible. So thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see everyone on the next one. Thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate it, man.